Sorry about that. I cut that short. Now we have part one and part two for the moms. But it's funny because this video has less women on it than the guys video had. The dad video had more people on it. This one has less. But my phone played games with me, so now I have to like make three videos. You know, Sorry about that, but that's how it is. Um, at 8, I have Ichigo's mom. Ichigo's mom's at number 8 because she grew up, or she, had kids. She had three kids. She had Yuzu, Karin, and Ichigo. Ichigo being the oldest, child, right? And Ichigo, and they were, their early years were spent with their mother, like it should be, you know. That day, I guess she and Ichigo, or she wanted to take Ichigo somewhere, and then Ichi can have the girls or whatever, and do whatever the fuck with that, right? That was the plan or whatever. But Ichigo ended up, witnessing his mother die, or Grand Fisher killed his mother. That hollow. You know, she protected Ichigo so he wouldn't die. She gave her life so Ichigo could live. Ichigo seen it that way too. My mother was my hero. I wouldn't be here without her. She didn't step in the way and take that, I wouldn't, and she sacrificed her life. You could easily have her higher than 8, and I don't not have her in the top 10, so, don't hate me for that. But, you know, she was definitely a great woman. That's why she's at 8, but at number 7, I have Sakura. Sakura, even though Sasuke wasn't there, she had to deal with Sarada, who I don't think hated her mother, but also, she always wanted to know about Sasuke, and Sakura knows how her and her relationship is with Sasuke. Sasuke never sticks around her too long. He likes her, but he can't be around her too long. You know, and she, kind of raised Sarada, and she did raise her, and kept her cool, whatever, right? Kept her alive, fed, have food on the table for her, and other things, right? The girl is, not a bad girl, and she don't hate her parents. She is not a bad mother, Sakura. But Hinata is better. She's at number 6. Hinata has Himawari and Boruto. She is like a really good mother. She's like, your father told you that you have to stay grounded because you went against what he said. You have to go to school. You have to have your, clothes and your food and, all that. She was actually better than Sakura all the time, and people knew that. But, and it's true, she's pretty good mom, you know. I don't even think that Boruto and Himawari even like hate their mother, you know, like at all. You know, I don't recall any of that. It was all towards Naruto because he ain't there and he ain't at the house, But, Hinata, is, I guess, the better parent in the eyes of the children. And then, they're alive and they're fed and they're well. And, she's not, beating their ass all the time. She ain't, being the abusive one or anything like that. She's kind of the soft one who's like, well, your father said you can't do this, so you can't do this, and reinforcing what he says, in the house, So, like you should. But he notches at number 6. At number 5, I have Android 18. Android 18 took care of Marin. I saw what she was doing. She was like, I'm gonna win this, money, and I'm gonna do it. Daddy could do it, but I'm gonna do it. And then Marin's like, my parents are cool. They both know how to fight. That little girl is saying shit like that. And she just really loves her mom, and her mom loves her. She went in Android 18 went into the tournament of power, because she knew she had to protect the universe. And what's her world? Her world is her kid, because she's a mother. That's who the fuck Krillin and Android 18 care about more than anything. They care about their little girl. So they went to fight in the tournament of power. Now they did get beat, but they were still there. Like before, they dusted some people out of the tournament. Some other people from other universes who were apparently the strongest in their universe. So they weren't, completely useless, but we knew that they were like the weaker end of Universe 7, but they still stepped forward and were like, we'll represent, for our girl and shit. So I got her at number 5. But at number 4, I got Izuku Midoriya's mother. She was a single mother. She was like, hey, I'm holding down for you and stuff. Boy, you're watching TV and shit. What's going on? She wasn't stern or anything about it. She was just like, what are you doing? And then she's like, he's like, hey, mom, come watch this. And she's like, what? And then he's like, this is what I want to be. Do you think I could be a hero? And then she's like, I don't know, son. You ain't showing any signs of anything. And this is when he's young, like a 5-year-old boy or something. And then the doctor comes and he's like, you know what? I don't think your boy can become a hero. And she's like, oh no, how do I even like bring myself to like tell my son this? I don't want to like crush his little heart or anything. And she's like, I'm sorry, Zuku, I wish things were different. And she's saying it like that the best she can, you know, in the nicest way possible. But he ends up, still getting into UA, and she's like, still there for him. She's like, oh, I'm so proud of you, son. You've done, this and that, and, I'm glad to be your mother, and, all that extra stuff. And, she's there for him when he breaks his arms and shit. And he's like, I'm worried about you. I don't want you to go back out there. You'll get hurt, But then he's like, no, I want to do this, and I want to do this. I can, too. He has to kind of convince her, that he'll be all right. He just got his ass whooped a little bit. He wasn't controlling his powers good enough. Once he has the hang of things, no one will be able to stop him. But she's a good mother. I ain't gonna say she's the worst. I got Miss Higurashi at number 3. I like Inuyasha, so I had the Inuyasha characters on the list too. She was there for Kagome. She was like, Kagome, you're gonna go to school. And she's like, yeah, I'll go to school. And, she did the thing like, normal people do, or whatever, normal life is, right? And she's there for her, and she's like, Kagome, get up for school. And, I'm here for, food's ready and all that extra shit. And then when she goes down into the hole, she comes back, at first she was kind of worried, and she was like, where's Kagome at, and other things. And then she's like, and she's kind of like, you're going to miss school and other things, at least, do you understand that, if you do this, then you ain't going to go to school? And she's like, well, I know, Mom. And, they had a great relationship, you know, yeah, so much so that then, she ended up taking care of, Sumeru's daughter, who was, similar to Inuyasha, and, Inuyasha like Kagome, and, she even let, basically she let Kagome stay in that world, because she was, 18 at the time she like left. You could either become a, whatever the fuck, she was going to, school for, or gonna go to college for, or you can go back into the well and, be there. And she was like, I want to be, with him. And she was like, okay, I'm here, and that type of thing. And she's like, just a mom, she's, there for Kagome when she can be. She ain't jumping into the well to find her or anything, but she's like, that mom that like stays at home, and like that's the home. Like, Kagome, this is your home. If you ever want to come back, you can come back. That type of thing. You know, but she's at number three. And I got number two, I got Chi Chi. Chi Chi was, I don't know. See, she had some problems, I guess, but she cared about Gohan. She didn't want to see him die and other things when he was younger and all that shit, right? You have to study for school, Gohan. You can't be out there with your dad and stuff. And, Gohan agreed with her. He's like, I don't want to be away from my mom's cooking and everything else. Then he grew to like being a Saiyan and shit like they usually do. And then he was like, I want to go to space and, go fight against, Frieza and all these other people. And she was like, no, you can't do that and all this other shit. But, that's her showing concern as a mother. I don't hold it against her and shit, personally. But I'm saying, she was really forcing those books down his throat. And then he became, later on that kind of like shot him in the foot, And then like he became a warrior that was basically, the most powerful. And she was like, is Gohan gonna fight in the, Cell games? And Goku's like, he'll be all right, that type of thing. Not telling her no, but not saying yes. And then she was like, he better not die or anything. And he didn't, because Goku wouldn't allow his son to die. He took that. And then she was without Goku, but she had, Goten and Gohan. She then, man, she knew that Gohan was like a good boy and shit, because she had to focus on Goten. And she was like, Goten, listen to your brother and, go to school and, or hit the books, like, trying to do what, that, what Gohan did. But she was, proud of Gohan. She was like, oh, you've done, Gohan, have you done your schoolwork, Gohan? And then, I guess you can go, play games with your brothers, your boys can go and then come back at, whatever time, that type of thing. And, she's there like that. And, later on, she's like, a grandmother and, still there for Goten. And, yeah, she's there and she's present and she's, taking care of them, the best you can. And then Goku's doing the fighting, taking care of them on that end so they don't have to, fight or, fight too much or any of that. But then when she, and she cares about them when they go to fight, she doesn't want them to die. She understands that this is Dragon Ball, but, too much of that shit, that's not good. And then, she wants to spend time with them. She don't want to be the only person at the house, she's just a girl, right? But she's at number two. I got Bulma at number one. I said Bulma Breeze is at number one because Trunks has a good life. He has, and Chi Chi, Chi Chi was, in the Chi Chi, she's kind of, she's hoping that Gohan has the, like, that's why she's part of the reason why she's like, you go to school and you hit those books because your father's a dumbass and you have to be the one to, become a person who gets a great job and has great wealth, and you have to do that, you know. But with like Bulma, she already has that because she was the one who was like kind of spoiled by her parents, who is Mr. Briefs, and a guy who's on par with Dr. Gero a little bit in like technology and shit. Not quite making androids and shit, but making spaceships and other stuff, these capsules and everything else. It's a whole corporation. And his mind did that. Bulma, you know, had Trunks with her, you know, and during the Cell games when he was a baby, and kept him cool. Then later on she was like, Trunks, you want to hang out with Goten, that's cool. I don't know what your father thinks about that, but I think it's all right. And then whatever that is, Trunks, don't run around too much. She cares about Trunks too. She don't want to see him die. And then when he came out and when the future Trunks came out of the time chamber, she's like, what happened to your hair? I need to cut your hair. She shows concern for Trunks. And she's still like, what? But she is kind of like, understands who Vegeta is, and she understands that she wouldn't, or Vegeta wouldn't let his son be weak. So she understands, and she's seen what her son did to Frieza. Like, Frieza was a fucking problem, and she's seen what the fuck he did, and she's like, I know what my son's capable of too. So she ain't looking down on him or anything. She knows that she could, count on him for any type of, thing like that too, and but she still cares about him too. Like, she has both of that. My son is capable warrior, but I still care about him. I don't want him to die. I don't want him to lose. That type of thing. And I got her at number one. You could have them switched out if you want to, y'all, but and that's the best moms in anime. But be cool, call in the corner, and let me know in the comment section of this video or the other video that I had. That was the best moms. This is part 2, and then part 1. But be cool, call in the corner.